Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest Urban Living webinar. Today, we are going to be addressing a very topical subject, and that is the pros and cons of new build versus repurpose in real estate projects. My name's George Sell. I'm editor of Urban Living News, and we are an online B2B platform for the hospitality and real estate sectors. Now, these webinars have a couple of sponsors, and we're just going to find out a bit more about them before we get stuck in. The first of our sponsors is Minute.
Dear hosts and property managers, hosting can be difficult. We get it. Watching out for parties, making sure your guests have a wonderful stay, keeping neighbors happy, coordinating cleaning and security staff. We see all the work you do every day, and we want to help. Wouldn't it be great to have a co-host? Someone to welcome your guests when they arrive. Remind them about house rules when they're getting a bit too loud. Keep your home safe when they leave. We're Minute, the co-host that helps you care for your home, guests, and community. We come highly recommended. We're reliable and we're eager to help. So let us be your co-host today. With love, Minute.
And our next, sorry, I thought we were going to have another video there. This webinar is going to last around an hour. We'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So if you do have questions for our speakers, please do submit them using the chat and the Q&A functions. If your question is about the topic that we're on at that exact moment, we'll try and answer it then, but we'll also save a bit of time towards the end of the session to get around to answering any others. And a link to a recording of the session will be emailed to everybody who is registered in the next couple of days. So our second sponsor for this series is Price Labs, and we're just going to see a very quick video about them. Okay, so thanks to Price Labs, and again, their contact details are in the chat if you'd like to get in touch with them and find out more. So just to give the conversation a bit of context, we're going to show some screen grabs from stories that we've run recently on our Urban Living News website, just to give you an idea of the flavour of some of the projects that we'll be talking about in the discussion today. As you can see, there's one there from Eden, who are represented by Andrew on the call today. They've acquired a London hotel and indeed a hotel in Switzerland for conversion to an apart hotel. An Edinburgh project there which is going to have mainly build to rent, but also some workspace involved. And on the next slide, a couple of interesting major scale new build projects in the UK. And then finally, some interesting conversions and just an idea of some of the types of conversions that are happening. So there's a hotel to co-live there in New York. Hudson was one of New York's kind of iconic boutique hotels a while back, but it had pretty small rooms. So I guess that's one of the more straightforward conversions. But we're also seeing things like retail to student, retail to resi, office to resi, and other things which we'll talk about in the discussion. So we've got a great panel joining us today, and I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves quickly, and we'll go from left to right as we see them there. So firstly, Andrew, good afternoon to you. Andrew, you're on mute.
How are you doing? How are you? Thanks for having me. Yes, Andrew Fowler, so co-founder of Locke Hotels, also of Birch Community, and I oversee all the strategic growth across Europe for the Eden platform, which also incorporates the Cove extended stay brand.
Thanks, Andrew. And Rebekka, good afternoon to you.
Thank you, Josh. Great being here today. I'm part of Zoku's development team. Zoku is a home office hybrid that's suitable for long and short stays. You can see behind me our loft, so it's very much a place for living, and our concept is very community focused and about connecting the building to the neighborhood, bringing different people together, and really creating the sense of community for our guests. We have 3 properties in operation, which is Amsterdam, where we also base and headquartered, plus Copenhagen and Vienna. And we're going to open our next property in Paris in the coming month. And interesting for this conversation is that Amsterdam was a former office, so that's a conversion building, and our other properties are new builds.
Thank you, Rebekka. And finally, Christopher, welcome to you, or Chris, I should say. We shouldn't be so formal, you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, great. Thanks, George. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Chris Carter-Keall. I work with Warwick Investment Group. We're a private equity funded, institutionally funded group who have recently set up in central London. We've currently got around 50 assets in Belgravia and Mayfair, where we're using and reutilizing old traditional assets and creating modern environments for longer term. So a mixture of ASTs, but generally, 1 to 2 years of occupation for travelers who are here for a longer period of time, and people who are moved into the UK for work purposes. So we have significant firepower that is we're bringing to bear in terms of new acquisitions, but we're looking at the very best locations in central London.
Thanks, Chris. You can see the LinkedIn profiles for all our panelists in the chat. So if you'd like to carry on the conversation with them afterwards, please do drop them a line. Chris, let's start with you, as you've recently been quite acquisitive, and you've been buying properties in London. Who is driving the decision whether to create a new build property or to convert the one you've got there? Is it you as the owner? Is it your architects? How involved are the planners? Who's in the driving seat here, or is it a mixture of all these factors coming together?
Yeah, I mean, in every decision, one has a group of consultants to give us advice, and then the decision is made via collaboration. It's not one that is taken quickly or lightly. It's just about making sure that we're delivering for our shareholders the best return we can after considering the options that are available. I mean, the assets that we've got in Belgravia and Mayfair, new build is not really an option, but to thinking in a wider context, the new build scenario is such that you can produce much more efficient stock than the 200-year-old assets that we're dealing with. So I think we're going to come on to talk more about operational carbon, and hopefully we're going to talk about embedded carbon, but those are the 2 measures that one must take into account when considering new or refurbished assets.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. Rebekka, the Zoku model is quite interesting because your units are kind of 1.5 stories. It's quite an unusual dimension. So I'm guessing for you, a new build would be the ideal, because it's easier than trying to adapt an existing building to your 1.5 story model. Is that right?
Well, partially, yes. This is indeed one of our biggest challenges when converting a building. I think old office buildings are quite nice for conversion, A, because they have a high level of repetition, and B, usually the ceiling height also works out for us. So we need a minimum of 2.85 meters to realize the loft that you can see behind us. But we have also reacted on this challenge because we have seen it coming back, and we have developed a new loft concept which can go down to 260. So we have something in the back end which we can use on buildings which might not have this possibility. But yeah, indeed, I think this is one of the specifications of Zoku compared to other hotels that are a bit more challenging for us. Yeah.
Okay, so potential new locations that you're looking at, you're happy to consider both options in that case?
Well, I think from a sustainability perspective, we do prefer conversions, and I think there's many benefits for conversions that we think are very, very relevant to consider. And again, I think we're going to get back to this more in detail later. But yeah, if you look at our pipeline, obviously we have a mix of both, and generally we are open towards each solution because I think there's good reasons for either way, and like also depending on the location, like it might be a good, like if it's a really redevelopment on the outskirts of the city, etc., that might be something where new build is just necessary. So yeah, I wouldn't say we are necessarily super exclusive one, but our like future strategy is, let's say, focused on conversions. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Rebekka. Andrew, Locke has been growing fast. You know, your expansion has been quite remarkable, really. And a lot of the buildings involved have been purpose-built apart hotels, but recently you've bought a couple of hotels to convert into apart hotels. Is this because it's necessary to keep up the speed of growth that you've maintained? You want to keep the momentum going, or because they were particularly attractive assets? What's the kind of decision process behind that?
It's probably a couple of key things driving that. Originally, we grew up on sort of ground up development. As we know, there's not an awful lot of extended stay hotels that you can acquire and convert readily in Europe, let alone the UK. And we were honing the concept. So starting with a blank canvas is always easier. Plus our previous investor was very much returns led. And it was a case of hitting those hurdles. And we had to take planning risk probably to get those original. We were with an opportunities fund before. So in order to get those returns, we were probably needed to go down a little bit of that route. So it played into where our headspace was at the time. But, you know, ultimately, you know, as Christopher says, we're driven by shareholder returns. And we'll adapt our strategy relative to where the market conditions are at that time. You know, picking up hotels up until very recently, very hard thing to do in terms of getting any kind of turn and return on it. Also, we've only in the last probably 12 months figured out how to adapt a hotel to an apart hotel. It's taken us a very long time to figure that out. And it's to do with the load on buildings. When you start putting, you know, apartments in there as opposed to hotel rooms, it changes an awful lot of things. So it's not just a case of it's very easy to convert a hotel, but now we've figured out a way to do it. It is definitely one of the arms of our strategy going forward, alongside office conversion. You know, disused or certainly secondary office has always been and probably will continue to be a primary strategy for us in the coming years. And because we are not a cookie cutter in terms of our approach to assets, we want each of our, well, we've got some very specific brand standards. We also want to curate something unique in every asset. So when you are given a canvas that is part built and you're forced to think in a certain way, it actually plays to design and creativity, plus where the capital markets are now in terms of the cost of or the risk associated with development and how they're costing the margin on debt, the additional time with planning from building on the ground up, all the levers point towards, you know, hotel or office conversion. I don't see us doing any ground up developments, although we're doing one in Paris at the moment. And until those prices come down considerably to allow us to suck up the additional cost of building from the ground up, even when you consider the efficiencies gained on the carbon footprint, which I'm sure we'll get into now. So, you know, similar to Chris, you know, we're investor-led and we'll adapt our strategy to what the market allows us to do.
Yeah, okay. So even though, I mean, we'll talk more about cost and financing in a minute, but even though converting hotel rooms to apartments is quite a major undertaking and presumably involves completely gutting floor plans and starting again, does it? But that's still more, makes more financial sense than a new build.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly we'll look at a hotel and we would go straight for the risers in that building, and we'll tell you very quickly whether you can convert that to an apart hotel. Equally, then you're looking at the layouts of the rooms and how they would convert. But as I said, they would probably be our primary focus at the moment, particularly tired. So old, tired 4-star hotels, because they need a considerable amount of capex put into them. If hotels are in relatively good nick, they'll generally convert better just to a bit of capex and be repositioned as a hotel. Generally, if they are tired and they have to have X amount put in anyway, well then it justifies going in and doing something radical. Also, older 4-star hotels typically have larger room sizes, which, you know, for a Locke concept, for example, we're looking at an average unit size of about 27 square meters. So you can't really pick up a modern Indigo hotel and convert that easily to serviced apartments. So it's a little bit of depends on an asset by asset basis.
Yeah, and also Andrew, I'll come to you shortly, Chris. But Andrew, you're in quite an interesting position as a company in that you operate a lot of properties that are owned by your owners, and you also operate buildings for other people. So presumably that means you can be more flexible as to the type of properties that you take on. But you mentioned you do have brand standards. How difficult are those to apply to some of these conversions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very rudimentary rule of thumb. You know, on a conversion building, we're looking to get to BREEAM very good, whereas on a new build, we'd be looking to get to excellent. On a more residential wording, that's the equivalent of probably EPC-A or EPC-B. And whilst we can probably get about up to 25% more efficiency in a new build, we've worked it out that it would take us about 29 years operating that to just on embedded carbon alone to make it worthwhile. And because of, you know, we can talk about the operational areas, other areas you can make savings. And then, as I said, when you add on where the finance spread is at the moment, you actually can't justify, we can't on our model, and I'd be interested to hear, you know, on residential and other models, office models, but at the moment we cannot justify building new build. It just doesn't pencil.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Chris, did you want to come in on something that Andrew was discussing there?
Yeah, it was just that having just listened to Rebekka and Andrew, you know, I think it's fairly obvious that certain assets are going to be more suitable for refurbishment than others, and it's quite interesting. Speaking in the London market at the moment, there's very much a focus on the best quality assets for offices, for example. So in the office market at the moment, there is a real move between the two, with secondary becoming very much poorer and the rental growth not coming through, and values falling in that secondary market, and the prime element still being relatively robust. So then it comes to what else can you do with that office building, as an example. And Andrew and Rebekka both mentioned, you know, risers. They've mentioned floor to ceiling heights. And of course, there's an area of the secondary market that is really suitable for that. You know, 1980s buildings were generally greater floor to ceiling heights and had better riser space than 1970s buildings. So, you know, then you start saying, well, we want to do refurbishment, but fundamentally, what can we do that with the stock that's available? And there's a group called CCREM who've been looking at the possibility of asset stranding, and that asset stranding is where an asset is not capable of being refurbished. And I think when it gets to that point, the values adjust, and then it becomes, as Andrew was saying, something that is more attuned to being a redevelopment than a refurbishment. So I just thought that was worthy of mentioning.
Yeah, and interesting, just to pick up on something Chris said there, was we did do some, you know, research on this, and we found that so office blocks where people, you know, we spend most of our time working, so where people almost live and work, they are more sensitive to being in an environment that is helping the environment. So, you know, they're carbon zero, they're carbon neutral building. They want to be working in an office like that. When people are staying away or visiting a property, whilst people are sensitive to how you're dealing with environmental impact, they are just as open to, you know, reused building that might have a bit of exposed concrete, you know, that you're putting your vegetable garden on the roof. There's other ways to achieve that same type of social connection with it. Whereas we found that offices much more sensitive to that. People want to work in an environment where they know that their boss is doing the right thing.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Chris, are you seeing a shift in attitudes amongst planners much more in favour of reuse wherever possible? And it's actually becoming, from speaking to people in London particularly, it's getting quite hard to convince them that a building should be knocked down and you know, completely redeveloped. Yeah,
I would say where the new build has attributes that the planners are seeking, then I think there is a keenness to capture those. But I do also think that the design teams involved at planning are trying to retain as much of the original character of the area and of the site, assuming it has any. And so I would say it's not anything different than it has been previously, but I do think that the design officers have more power than perhaps they used to.
Yeah. Okay. Andrew, you were nodding when I mentioned about London planners. Is that a situation you're encountering elsewhere too?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard of people, you know, voicing how they want passive buildings, etc. But ultimately, you know, from what we've seen is that planners are still driven by what targets they need to hit, whether it's, you know, employment, whether some are resi focused. They continue to vastly control the majority of the decision making.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to touch on some of the main challenges involved in converting buildings to new uses. Some of the bullet points I've put down here are retrofitting technology, adapting floor plans and access, both for construction workers and then eventually for customers. Rebekka, what are the main things that you consider when looking at a potential asset to convert into a Zoku?
So to be honest, the first thing we're probably looking at is not even on your list because it would relate to zoning. I think this is one of the biggest challenging as well. So to see what the plan of the municipality is and whether this building is a fit in the first place. And then the next thing we look at is indeed, definitely the floor plans, because I feel like this is the hard factor, right? Technology is also a challenge, but that's something you can probably work around somehow. But indeed the floor plans. And if a building has historical parts which we cannot change, especially for our concept, that tends to be quite difficult. So indeed historical parts and the layout. I think this is the key factors.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, is there anything you want to add to that as a
Yeah, I think, again, I mentioned on it earlier, luckily, you know, we are not a cookie cutter approach to property. We relish the kind of the design and the creativity challenge posed by an existing asset, but at the same time it has to work from a viability standpoint. And typically what we would look for versus say like a hotel conversion is we like deeper units, you might say. So with the apart hotel model, certainly our model, you're looking for deeper, thinner units because you've got less circulation associated per unit, so you've got a better gross to net. So often what we find is buildings that probably don't convert to other uses, say if it's going from office to residential or office to hotel, actually might work for a part hotel. So it can actually be an advantage to us sometimes. Although our revenue managers, when we give them more than the supposed 3 or 4 unit types, they do tend to get a little bit cross with us. But
okay. Chris, working in Belgravia and Mayfair, are you coming across heritage buildings, listed buildings, and how does that affect your thoughts on what to do with them?
Well, very much so. I think the key for us is to simply improve on the operational elements and really be and listen to our customers. We've got a mixture of assets that are found attractive by anyone from overseas students through to single families, and we found that, you know, just that ability to be on demand, so to speak, when required, and actually delivering good quality space, and being able to be very proactive, is something which we're finding is being well received by our customers. We're not having to do a huge amount to those particular assets, albeit, to go back to the point that Andrew and I made at the beginning, shareholder return is proving to be harder and harder to do when you don't actually do that much. You simply just operationally make it more efficient. So what we're now starting to move towards in order to create shareholder value is, as Andrew said, more active asset management and refurbishment, and trying to add more space where we can. And that is where we're coming into discussions with planners and design officers. But, you know, ultimately, if we can find accommodation that is has the opportunity, either with a planning application that's elapsed, or there's some sort of opportunity to add value, then that's where we can really start to move our offer forward. And we're about to launch our first brand, which is going to be called Acantha, and that will seek to deliver those operational efficiencies and obviously provide our customers with what they want. So that will happen early in the new year.
Mm-hmm. And in that part of London, would you potentially pass over acquisition opportunities if the planning constraints that went along with them due to listed status or something like that became too onerous? Does the charm of the building not stack up against shareholder returns?
Well, I'm afraid it has to be the shareholder return first. I think ultimately one can fall in love with a building probably more when you're occupying it yourself. We have to be pretty clean and clear about this. Where it works operationally, as Andrew was saying, those are the ones we go for, and we have to be, you know, a quick no is better than a slow no, isn't it?
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about the sustainability piece and the carbon piece, because this is really, I think, the crux of the matter. One thing I'm interested to find out is how you calculate whether the best option is to knock something down and start again, or to convert it and try and retrofit with the best technology available. And it seems to me that thinking is moving towards retrofitting repurposing wherever possible, particularly with the planners. But I'm just, when you're considering a project, how do you make the calculation in the first place around which is the most environmentally friendly option? Andrew, do you want to kick off with that one? You're on, Andrew.
Sorry, I had a bit of background noise. Yeah, we could probably use one of the recent examples. I think we could use the one you put up of the Kensington asset, because whilst obviously we're driven by shareholder return, you know, the shareholders are going to want to see the ESG piece in there and the justification of why we are doing that. So that, you know, the ESG is very much considered as part of the shareholder return, and, you know, we can get into debates on exit yield in terms of what a BREEAM excellent building versus a BREEAM very good might impact exit yields in 25 years. But that we ran an example on that just because we're trying to figure out 100% how this ESG thing works, as most people are, that there would be about 3.5 million kilograms of CO2 of embedded carbon that would have gone into a new build there, an addition of, compared to repurposing the existing asset. And I think I wrote it down somewhere that that's the equivalent of 3,900 return flights to New York. And we reckon that we could probably make a maximum of 25% savings on efficiency of building if we built something from the ground up, which would save us about 485,000 kilograms of carbon per year. And it would take us 29 years to recoup that on a Locke. apart hotel. So when you add that with the spiraling debt cost margins on ground up development debt compared to conversion debt, it's a pretty clear-cut case for us at the moment. We've lost George, have we?
I think we might have done. But another good example was one I think that CBRE gave in their recent report, which obviously looked at putting PV onto a 10,000 square meter office building, and the solar panels associated, sorry, the carbon associated with those solar panels could add 50% to the original embodied carbon and take more than 20 years to pay back. So, I think it's interesting to see that those sort of numbers coming out. Sorry, George, you're back.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Apologies about that. Andrew, I asked you a question, and just as you were about to answer, everyone disappeared. So apologies.
I did answer the question. You'll be glad to know, and Christopher followed up.
We were filling for you, George.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate that's never happened before on one of these webinars. I really don't know what happened there. Okay, so here's the thorny one. A lot of the big real estate companies and a lot of the big investment companies who own and buy a lot of real estate have got quite ambitious net zero carbon targets that are looming. They're not too far away in the future. Is it possible to achieve net zero carbon in a converted building? Rebekka, do you want to take that hot potato first?
I'm really curious to hear about the opinion of the other panel, but I think it is very, very challenging without the possibility to offset. So I think it's really the question, how do you find net zero, right? Because we have actually incidentally today announced that Zoku Amsterdam is now carbon neutral, which is fantastic, but we were also not able to do it like net zero, but obviously a couple of emissions we had to offset, right? So obviously that is a solution that a couple of brands are taking, which I have seen. And I think for the moment, it's maybe also one that works, because if you look at like the leading players like Edge, for example, right? I mean, they have plans of being like net zero by like 2050, which is still really far away. And also they are at this moment in time offsetting the emissions. So I think it is still pretty far away to really achieve something like this. But I'm curious to hear.
No, but it is worth saying that, of the stock that is out there now, 80% of it will still be here in 2050. So it's almost a question of not whether if it's possible, it's how far can we get with the stock that we have.
I'm pretty sure it's Heinz who have set a 2040 target without offsetting, which is really ambitious. So presumably that means some of their estate is going to have to be carbon positive, let alone neutral. They're going to have to be sucking carbon in from elsewhere to offset the other ones. But on the question of offsetting, what the kind of methods that that you guys prefer? What are you doing in Amsterdam, for example, Rebekka, to offset the emissions from that building?
We are supporting climate projects, but I'm going to be really honest. I'm not entirely sure from the top of my head where, but I know that we are basically supporting projects which are really focused on decreasing greenhouse emissions elsewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. And Andrew, what's Eden's policy on this?
Yeah, ours is very much to kind of work with local. In some ways, it would be easier to buy a hemp field in somewhere else in the world. But really, it's a case of trying to take a practical approach to it, work with local communities and what they're doing, whether it's recycling, reuse, but just trying to make it relevant as opposed to trying to do it for the sake of doing it, if that makes sense. And hopefully that will build momentum into something meaningful over the coming years, because everyone's still trying to figure out how do we actually properly measure this.
Yeah. Chris, a lot of this ESG momentum is coming from the investment community. What's your stance at Warwick, and what kind of timelines have you set yourself?
Yeah, so we're not dissimilar. 2040 is our sort of timeline that we're aiming at. I think there are a number of things which are still relatively low-hanging fruit. I think behavioural ways that we can do that with our occupiers to encourage them to, ensure that they're keeping the heating at a level which is appropriate, where they're turning lights off, etc., and our leases do contain those sort of encouragements. We don't have anything in our leases at the moment which say more draconian elements to it, but I think behavioral is a very major one. Once those low-hanging fruit are picked, so to speak, then it comes down, I think, to insulation. So we're going about a significant insulation approach, and obviously also trying to look at either air source heat pumps but obviously we've got older buildings, so the insulation has to come first in order for the air source heat pumps to have a chance. So I think overall we're trying to do the physical elements to give us our best shot. We, as Andrew said, we haven't quite got to the place of buying hemp fields yet, but we know a number of people that are starting to invest in forestry, etc., to offset their urban carbon emissions.
There was quite an interesting study that came out last week looking at the PBSA market, and it was basically focused on the importance of tenant engagement in cutting carbon emissions, and they came out with some incredible numbers about how much carbon could be saved just by turning thermostats down by a couple of degrees. This was properties where bills are all inclusive in the rent, so obviously there's quite a big incentive for them to do that. But occupier behavior is obviously something that you can't predict when you're either converting or building a new asset. So it's an interesting piece of jigsaw.
One point worth noting is we've found a kind of a clear answer on is we're moving away from gas towards electricity on a lot of buildings, whether they're ground up. The technology on gas heating is quite still rudimentary. It hasn't been developed, from an efficiency aspect, whereas electricity systems have. And while typically they're, it almost, if you were building a residential property, it's still worth putting in a gas-fired central heating system because the heat pump technology is so expensive. It would take you years to recoup it, but on commercial buildings like ours, we're seeing considerable savings now in steering away from gas towards electricity technologies.
Yeah. I think that's right. But the only problem with that is that EPCs currently don't give you any benefit to electrical over gas. I mean, the EPCs are changing next year, so hopefully that will enable owners to be able to see their EPCs improving as a result of what Andrew's saying. But what we've done is we've tried to take advantage of green finance, and that gives us a reduced interest rate, assuming we have EPCs of C and better. So, when we bought assets that have been below, it's encouraged us to focus on getting all of those units up to a C or better. And those have been along the lines of what I've just been talking about.
And is that green finance, Chris, based purely on hitting an EPC target, or are there more criteria than those? Okay.
Not as yet. But
and what are the potential cost differences between securing this green finance and going to a, for regular?
It's between 0.5 and 3/4 of a point.
Okay.
Is that residential or commercial, Christopher? Residential, yeah.
I think going back to your point earlier, Andrew, I think all new homes from 2025 must be electric. I don't think you're allowed to fit a gas boiler after then in a new unit. So that's moving pretty quickly. On the subject of finance, Andrew, you mentioned earlier that new builds in the current economic climate aren't really viable. Is that across the kind of European countries you're operating in, or are you basing that,
that's across Europe? I suppose I should correct that by saying not so much that they're viable, but it's impossible to underwrite to a credit committee standard because there's so many of the key variables are moving still or in flux. from build cost inflation, forward yield curves on the debt. But ultimately, you know, the debt margins on ground up development for us at the moment, probably 5.5%, 6% over SONIA. So, you know, interest rates heading for 4%, you're looking at nearly 10% debt on development. Refurb probably get around 4, maybe just above 4, and then on investment finance probably somewhere around 3. So, you know, you've got nearly a 200 basis point spread on conversion versus ground up. Then add in the time cost of money of that year for getting planning and getting the frame up. Again, it just points to what I was saying earlier.
And are you seeing this backdrop of prices going up across the piece? So, you know, materials prices going up, labour costs going up, as well as finance. Is that causing delays in your new build pipeline?
No, we've been on time, delivering stuff on time. You know, when you take the sort of the COVID out of it, seems to be okay. Seems to be fine.
Okay. And Rebekka, are you seeing a slowing down in the new build opportunities coming your way as the kind of pendulum of financial viability swings more and more in the direction of conversions?
Yeah, definitely. We have really seen an uptick in conversion buildings that are coming our way. Yeah, I mean, we touched about it already, I think, especially office buildings, which is a very interesting development. Yeah, so we see this more and more, like secondary office buildings, which are maybe not according to the top sustainability standards, etc. So they are looking for value add conversion, and I think this is something that we're really gonna, yeah, focus on in the next coming years.
And am I right in thinking that you're going to be adding quite a lot more workspace in your new developments? So, you know, if you are converting an existing office asset, you're actually repurposing some of it into more, you know, more functional contemporary type of office, and then having accommodation above that. Is that right?
Well, I think the beauty of Zoku and why it is a really interesting concept for a lot of stakeholders, so also municipalities and investors, etc., is that we are making really smart use of space. So whereas, for example, in an office building, you use it for 9 to 5 during the day, but basically the majority of the time it's actually empty. We are kind of like hosting different functions on the same square meter. So as you can see on the picture of the loft behind me, basically it's a space where you can really sleep and work. You can even have meetings, you can invite people over, etc. So it's a space that's super multifunctional and can basically be used 24/7. So for example, what we're doing and what we've been doing a lot during COVID is to rent the lofts out during the day as office spaces. And that obviously increases the value per square meter, which is really interesting. Yeah, but it also means that we are basically creating a very vibrant building because we have workspaces indeed, which are a bit more focused on the co-working. We have meeting and event spaces. Our social spaces also double down with different functionalities, and we are always very connected to the local neighborhoods. So I think that's something that's really special at Zoku. So we have a lot of local guests who also make use of our facilities. And yeah, basically the bigger picture means that we're really taking a one functionality building to something that has like multiple functions indeed on the same square meter.
Thanks, Rebekka. Have any of you looked at any potential retail conversions? Andrew, I don't know if have you seen the conversion of the former Phoenix department store in Leicester into a nice apart hotel? Have you looked at anything like that? I suppose the focus,
you know, on developing the Cove brand post-COVID has been, you know, it doesn't need the front of house, you might say, at street level. It can sit in above retail. So definitely an area that we've been looking at, and I think we'll see more of it for the very reasons that you said, repurposing retail. And on the subject of new build being financially harder at the moment, are there any kind of building techniques or materials or processes around the corner that might change this? So I'm thinking of, you know, modular and prefabricated construction that will cut site labor bills and so on. Is there anything happening in that space that might change things? Yeah, I mean, we've looked at those, obviously, cross laminate timber, etc., but good for residential projects and, you know, smaller projects. You can't go too large or too wide, the building starts to flex. Or you would have to make the columns so wide to accommodate a lot of our buildings. It renders it probably not quite at the level of technology we need it yet for our use and our size. Modular as well. We've gone down that route, and unless you own and control the modular company, it's a very risky place to go. I won't bore you with the details, but yeah, it's sort of pushed us away from that a bit.
Okay, Chris, I saw you nodding your head there. What are your thoughts on modular? And
yeah, I mean, I think similar to Andrew in a way. I mean, the one thing I was thinking of was the 7-story timber building that was being built in Shoreditch that I think Blackstone were funding, and I haven't actually heard anything more about that. So it's obviously done okay. So, but it is as Andrew said, something where you can't build those timber ones particularly high. And from a modular perspective, I've only heard of hotels where they've done the various bathrooms and craned those in, and that seems to be a modern approach which has been very much taken on board by a number of developers. But again, it comes back to who's behind the actual construction.
Yeah, our Canary Wharf project that we're building, the Locke project, that's actually a 23 odd story full modular build, and where we're prefabricating the entire unit off-site. That's a JV with Canary Wharf Group, but as I said, the modular group went bust, and we've managed to work with people now to buy out that modular group and control that group, obviously to save that development. Now, obviously, no one foresaw the rising cost inflations, etc. But just something you need to be wary of going down that route. The one thing we traditionally said was, you can't do a design-led product in modular, great for residential or cookie cutter 3-star hotel, but we have managed to do that. But as I said, it's what we thought we were going to save on speed to market, etc. Hasn't worked out that way. But it's another element of risk that you don't control, that you can't wrap up in a fixed price DB contract.
Andrew, you mentioned that you. Sorry, Chris, carry on.
No, I was just going to say I was involved with the Leadenhall building, and that was perhaps back in the day one of the best examples of modular, but in a very controlled way, and that everything was bought on site, 60,000 tons of steel, and as Andrew said there, the steel manufacturer or the steel company went bust. The bolts had to be entirely replaced on the whole building, so 3,000 bolts. There was a huge legal challenge to that. So it was one of those ones which modular, whilst it pushes the boundaries, it does have risks attached to it.
Yeah, it creates a domino effect. As I said, you have to go through and really sign off all the. It was more trouble than it's worth. But my advice would be, if you're going to go modular, make sure you own the modular company as well.
Agreed.
Okay. Andrew, you mentioned as a benchmark that your new build properties are around the BREEAM excellent mark, and the conversions perhaps are very good. So a 2-part question: is BREEAM the standard that everybody is using? And secondly, have you got a rough operational cost comparison between a building of a similar size that's rated excellent versus one that's rated very good?
Yeah, I mean, we use BREEAM. We also, I should know the name of the other ones, but they vary across Europe, but they're all pretty much similar. BREEAM is the one that we're all sort of use in terms of the language in the office. Yeah. As I said, we can get, on a BREEAM excellent building, we can get up to 25% operational efficiency, but on a BREEAM very good to a BREEAM excellent building, you're probably looking high single digits in terms of efficiency operationally between the two buildings.
Yeah, okay. Rebekka, are there any other accreditation or rating schemes that we should be aware of? I know in the States, LEED seems to be a big one. Is BREEAM the one that you guys use?
We do use BREEAM as well for Amsterdam and New Paris building. What we have in Copenhagen and Vienna is DGBN. And what I like about this one is that it takes the entire life cycle of the building into account. So basically it also considers the dismantling at the end. And I think this is a pretty nice approach. It's a system that's pretty established in Germany, I believe, and then the Nordics, not entirely sure. But yeah, this for sure is one that I think is definitely a really nice approach and is, yeah, nice to use. But otherwise, BREEAM is also our go-to for sure.
And in a related topic, Rebekka, I saw on LinkedIn that Zoku is now a B Corp. Can you explain what that actually means and how that relates to how the buildings are operated?
Yeah, absolutely. So B Corp is a very holistic certification. So basically it refers to all of the ESG factors mutually. Currently our Amsterdam property is B Corp certified already since a couple of years, and we're now working on also the other properties. So you really have it per location. And yeah, I think what's nice about it is that it's really considering operations, building, but also governance and the social aspect of like your contribution to, well, the world. And in terms of sustainability, I think, I mean, in the end, the criteria are somewhat similar to, let's say, Green Key. So it's operationally focused mainly. But yeah, I think it's a nice certification. And I think we're also the first hospitality company in the Netherlands to achieve this, because it's quite difficult to certify a hospitality operational process. Yeah, no, but I think it's a great certification. I know it's also growing in the Netherlands at the moment and across Europe in general. But yeah, the key is really that it has this like holistic approach to the factors.
Okay, thanks, Rebekka. Chris, can we talk about resale values for a moment? I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit about your strategy with these buildings that you've acquired in terms of what you foresee as the kind of predicted hold period, and when you do come to divest, what are the pros and cons of a new build versus a conversion property that's been done well?
Sure. I mean, I think ultimately, as long as you are keeping up with legislation and as long as you have a relevant building, there should be no differentiation between a new build and a second-hand building. You know, ultimately, as long as you're keeping both of them at a prime status. As I was saying earlier, there's a number of buildings that are starting to fall away and become secondary and tertiary, and that has a significant implication on the yield, as you would imagine. I think, therefore, that what we're doing is very much maintaining and improving the assets to ensure that they maintain their status. And as long as they do, we see no reason why there would be any discount to a new build.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Andrew, you across your portfolio now, you've got quite a number of new builds and quite a number of conversions. Have you got any customer feedback about which they prefer? Have you managed to quantify that at all?
Yeah, we've done a fair bit of customer feedback actually the last 12 to 18 months. And as I said, it's come back as people are enthused as much to see repurposing of buildings done in a creative way, especially where there is some design elements. Like, we've actually found that if you can unlock design, whether it's, even if it's, fairly rudimentary industrial design, or through to some beautiful listed buildings we have, if you can do something in an authentic way that really ties into the design story of the hotel, particularly linked to what we call indigenous architecture, so local architecture. We want each of our assets to link with the locality and tell a story. That actually brings more guest satisfaction, we believe, than if we had a shiny, brand new, super efficient building, solar panels on the roof, rainwater recycling, etc. And what we got out of that, as I said earlier, was where people are, you know, working and spending their day, they seem to be more focused on that. I mean, also our demographic, I suppose, they come to Locke because they're a little bit design-led anyway. It's the concept, so they're probably going to appreciate the reuse of existing materials merged into design maybe more than other demographics. So I think that's just purely the case for Locke, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the last point I want to touch on is whether new builds have made cities all start to look the same. I mean, there's a neighbourhood in London, which I referred to a couple of times before, down at Vauxhall around the new US embassy. And if you wandered around there, if you couldn't smell the sort of briny tang of the Thames, you'd have no idea you're in London, because there are a lot of very undistinguished, similar looking towers there. And, you know, you could be anywhere in the world, really. So Rebekka, how do you manage to instill a bit of local character and local ambience into a new build design?
Well, we're always working a lot with local partners. So in terms of like, yeah, interior decoration and design. But I think it's also not just about the looks, but also about like the operation. So by having, let's say, local musicians coming over on a Friday night and playing music, right? Like all those things also kind of like play into this like connectivity to the neighborhood. So I think in a lot of ways we're trying to like have the locals be a part of the building. And like in Vienna, we have this amazing rooftop garden, for example, and there's a lot of local gardeners who come over and like help us with this. So I feel like this is also a really important part. So even though it's new builds, there is still like a connectivity to the neighborhood, and you can also see and feel this a little bit in the design and in the activities.
Yeah. It needs the engagement of the local authority, George. That's the key, and I think Vauxhall's failed on that front, really. I mean, it just doesn't have any soul. Whereas to a certain extent, what Get Living have done out at the old Olympic Park seems a little bit more engaging. You know, they've got the restaurants that are part of their ownership as well. They do this big night in where the restaurants and the occupiers all you know, use each other, and it's, you know, it feels a much more joined up approach, and I think that's perhaps what's missing out of your Vauxhall example. Yeah, great stuff. Well, thanks guys. Thanks Rebekka, Andrew and Chris for your contributions. A really interesting discussion. That's flown by as usual. Just going to show a couple of quick slides before we sign off. So our next Urban Living webinar is on November the 30th. It's called Meet the Money, and it will be a panel of investors in the real estate space. If you'd like to register for that, you can see a link in the chat. We are hosting an event tomorrow, an in-person event. It's the first one we've done specifically focusing on the senior living sector, which is an interesting market at the moment. I believe there are still a couple of tickets left. Again, there's a link in the chat there, but you'll have to be quick because it's starting at 8:30 tomorrow morning. And another of our events, this is one that I really enjoy actually, it's called Recharge. It moves around various European cities every year. And in January, we are going to be in Lisbon. Again, more info in the chat. You can see the agenda and you can see some of our fantastic sponsors there. So we're going to leave the session open for a couple of minutes with the countdown clock again, just so you can take some notes of all the info that's in the chat there. If you're on any of the social channels you can see there, then do follow us. We're quite active on all those channels. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to Minute and to Price Labs for sponsoring. Thanks to you all for watching, and hopefully see you all again soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.